Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, Jeff Charles, your favorite conservatarian, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I've got another awesome fire guest for you guys today. We're going to be talking Second Amendment, guns, all that good stuff, all about the gun debate and what we need to know. I mean, that's yet another topic that everybody's talking about with the Supreme Court's ruling. So I'm very excited to get into this with this particular guest, because he is an expert and he's gonna drop a lot of knowledge for y'all. But before we get into everything, you already know what I'm gonna say. You already know what to do. You need to like this video. You need to share this video, and you need to subscribe if you have in your life. And once you hit that subscribe button, all of your wildest dreams will come true. So hit that subscribe button, smash that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload an interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern. Also, if you want to support my work monetarily, you've got the links in the show notes here. You got the Cash App, the Venmo app, the PayPal app, and all the other apps. I appreciate all of it. It helps me to bring you this wonderful content. Now, without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and bring him on. He is a law professor at Ave Maria School of Law, and he is a constitutional attorney. I give you Mr. Mark W. Smith. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. I know you're an expert in all these things. It's funny. I feel like I'm interviewing a lot of constitutional attorneys lately. I guess because of these Supreme Court rulings, but I think we're gonna have a good time here. But before we get into everything, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, all that good stuff.
Sure. Well, I'm a constitutional attorney. I was a practicing lawyer for many years. Over the last few years, I really moved into academia with a focus on the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms, which I've written, several books about. So now I'm a professor of law, a scholar, focusing mostly again on Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms issues. I have my own YouTube channel called The Four Boxes Diner, which is all about really sort of the scholarship and the history of the Second Amendment. I'm a big believer, Jeff, that we in schools are not taught properly about the entire Constitution. The teachers, whether it be in high school, college, or even law school, they cherry pick the topics that they want to talk about. And inevitably, they don't really tell you the full story of our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, which is a fundamental right. They always seem to skip over that. And to the extent they mention it at all, Jeff, of course, they refer to it in sort of an anti-gun, in my view, anti-historical kind of way, ignoring the real teaching. So I wanted to fill that gap with my YouTube channel, The Four Boxes Diner, to provide information to people such as yourself and the viewers and others that talk about this issue, so they really can feel comfortable with when I give them information. Doesn't mean I'm perfect, but when I give them information, they feel that it's been vetted by a real Second Amendment scholar who's looked at this carefully, who's been cited by federal judges in support of the Second Amendment, and they can feel with a little bit of confidence that they can go forth and conquer with the right information and the historical facts on their side.
Awesome. So tell us about how you got into the space in the first place. Like what prompted you to even start this YouTube channel and to really get involved in educating people on this?
Well, I've always been a big supporter of the Constitution and the United States of America. I'm proud to be an American. No one's perfect. Nothing's perfect. Nothing that humans touch is perfect, including our country. But I do recognize that if you look around the globe over time, there is no better country to live in. There's no higher quality of life. There's no place that allows itself to be reformed for more freedom rather than less freedom. So I'm proud to be an American. And one of the things I've noticed over the last many years is there seems to be a narrative that's very anti-American, especially anti-Second Amendment, anti-right to keep and bear arms, because, Jeff, you know this better than anybody. There's really three components to being a full citizen in any society. And this notion, by the way, goes back to Greco-Roman times. It goes back thousands of years. Full citizens have three things in common. First, they have the right to own their own private property, to be economically self-sufficient. They can feed their families and take care of themselves, self-reliance, self-sufficiency. So it's private property is essential to that. The second thing is the right to vote, the right to have a say in how your society is governed. And the third thing is the right to protect yourself, the right to bear arms. Those are really the three critical elements to being a full citizen in a society. And yet what I've been seeing over the last many years, I'm sure you've seen it as well, is there's a chipping away at all these things, in particular, the right to defend yourself. So now we live in a world where you have really, open borders. Your police are being told to stand down. We want to defund the police. We have no bail, which, no bail means no jail. So people that probably should be off our streets so they don't hurt innocent people are on our streets, and that shouldn't happen. At the same time, many of these same groups and people are simultaneously arguing that we, Jeff, should have no means to protect ourselves against the predators among us. And I have noticed this several years ago. Then I started to notice there was a movement in certain quarters of our society to try to, what I consider, rewrite history in a way, or redefine it, whatever you say, when it comes to our self-defense private gun culture. And I decided that someone with appropriate, academic and legal and intellectual credentials needed to sort of step into this void and really drill down into these articles that get written in law reviews and in intellectual circles, which, I love the gun community, but, the intellectual circles that you really have to have some sway over doesn't always touch fingers with our American gun culture. And I'm trying to sort of bridge that gap, Jeff, if you will, so that I can talk to the intellectuals about American gun culture in a favorable way so they better understand it. And at the same time, trying to help the American gun community understand how the so-called quote unquote intellectuals, public thinkers are thinking and what they're trying to do to sway Americans either for or against gun rights. And I'm trying to bridge that gap and help people understand what goes on there.
Yeah, that's important. I mean, because there are a lot of people who are into guns and gun culture, like you said, but they don't know the history, and then they really don't even know how to articulate these positions. And the right to self-defense is under a threat, like you just mentioned that. And some people would hear that and be like, "Oh no, you're crazy. We're not going to lose the right to defend ourselves." Yeah, right. Look what happened in New York City with Jose Alba and that bodega worker.
Right.
That man defended a clear case of self-defense, and he's facing second-degree murder charges. I'm sure you heard about that case, right?
Yeah, and look, it's exactly right. It's an ongoing, comprehensive attack to make us serfs, to make us subjects. It's not hyperbolic, Jeff. There are people in the society that do not want you and I to be full-blown citizens anymore. They want us to be told what to do, and we do it. Whatever they want to come up with, if they want us to eat, 2 pounds of crickets a day as our diet, they want us to obey, and they want us to be serfs and subjects and not full-blown citizens. And I think part of that is to take away not only our private property rights, but also to take away our right to keep and bear arms, and also to slowly but surely disenfranchise us relative to, all the other people in the country. So I think with all of this said, Jeff, there is an attempt to reduce the notion of individual reliance, self-sufficiency, individualism in the American experience. And I think that's a terrible mistake all the way around.
Well, yeah, and it's a horrible mistake. I mean, and the way I see it, Mark, is they're trying to, one of the things that they're trying to do is, because, if you own a gun, you can defend yourself, right? You're not relying on the government. You may call the police, but, if the guy's at your doorstep, you're going to need to be able to defend yourself. But when you realize that, then you realize, oh, maybe I don't need the government as much. I mean, with this guy in New York City, what were we supposed to do? Like, call the police while the guy's beating on him? No, he took matters into his own hands. He defended himself. And that is being frowned upon by these woke district attorneys, the people who don't want us to be armed, because I think one of the ultimate objectives, like you said, to create a serf class that is dependent on the elites, even though the elites aren't going to always show up for us, right?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. I think there's several points that you really made well there, Jeff. I think, I always like to joke that the movie The Hunger Games, where everything goes to Capital City and everyone fights over the scraps, is not actually a movie. It's actually a documentary. Right. And I think that's kind of the way it is, right? We're supposed to feed all of our, assets, information, intelligence, and resources and money to Washington, D.C. And then they decide who is well-behaved and gets the stuff, and who's poorly behaved and doesn't get the stuff. So really, again, I think Hunger Games may be a documentary of the United States, at least where we might be moving to in the minds of some. But you're absolutely right that one of the thing about being a gun owner is you minimize the risk of being a victim. And again,
Mhm.
if you are able to take care of yourself, you don't need government nearly as much as someone who can't take care of themselves. And again, I think if you're part of the ruling class, however you want to define that, certainly you're much better off if people need you to give them their livelihood, their self-protect, their protection and the like. And that's the society that we see, for example, in many parts of Europe, and of course in Asia. And I think that there are many people who would like to see us move to either a European or an Asian style society where we're dependent upon the government, some sort of communitarianism, if you will. And I'm not interested in that, because if you look, again, I think our country has been the most successful country that's ever existed. It remains that way today. And I don't want to lose that. And I don't even think, frankly, the people that think this would be a good plan to give up these free speech rights, to give up these rights to keep and bear arms, to give up other constitutional rights, to allow for censorship, I don't think they fully understand and appreciate why this doesn't help anybody, including them, in the long run.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, and you're right. There are people who want us to be more like Europe. I mean, you look at what happened in Canada. I mean, what happened to them? I mean, it's like they progressed in that area too. So yeah, this is a very real threat. But I think the good thing, I mean, if I'm going to look at the silver lining here, we are winning some victories. I mean, I know that you're probably excited about that Supreme Court's decision on the New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. What's your take on that ruling, and how do you think it's going to affect the ongoing gun debate?
Well, I think that the Nysurpa versus Bruin decision by the Supreme Court is great and a long time coming. Let's think just briefly about the text of the Second Amendment. It says, the right of the people to keep and to bear arms shall not be infringed. So those are really two different rights. The right to keep, Jeff, means you have the right to own, to possess, to acquire firearms, to have firearms. But then you also have that to bear. What does to bear mean? Well, we know what to bear means. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she was alive, talked about what to bear meant. Not exactly a right-wing conservative, Justice Ginsburg.
Yeah,
But even she said the
really.
right to bear means the right to carry. So the right to bear means to carry guns outside the home for the purposes of self-defense, which I should say this, and this is very important to understand as I see it, Jeff, which is that the Supreme Court really was bringing 6 rogue outlier states into line. These states like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, California, Hawaii, these sort of may issue jurisdictions, anti-gun jurisdictions, were basically told by the Supreme Court, it's time to get your acts together. You are not above the United States Constitution, nor can you pick and choose the parts of the Constitution that you like. The Second Amendment applies to you. Your citizens in those states have a right to bear arms, and you must recognize this and allow them to do so and not get in their way. Because remember, right now, as we sit here today, during this conversation, there are 25 states right now, the Supreme Court noted this, that allow for permitless carry. Permitless carry means that you can carry, assuming you're a law-abiding adult, you can carry a gun on your body, loaded, ready for self-defense in 25 states right now. Permitless carry. And then you have 43 states in total that allow either permitless carry and or shall issue, which basically means once you meet some basic criteria, you're law-abiding, maybe you've had some training, you're not a criminal, etc., then you're allowed to carry as well. So we're really only talking about 6 or 7 jurisdictions here that were the outliers. And of course, these are also the states that are mostly controlled by huge Democratic cities, such as New York City controls New York. And of course, we know San Francisco and Los Angeles, big Democratic cities, control California. So when you see these states, you really are seeing cities, urban Democratic politicians lording over the people in the rest of the state. And the Supreme Court stepped in and says, no more, you can't do this anymore going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it really was momentous. I mean, I was really anticipating this ruling, and I have another friend, Scott, who's also a constitutional attorney, and we would talk about it. And after the ruling came down, I had him on my show. I say, okay, so does this, in a sense, in a legal sense, do away with the idea of a may issue state? And he said, yes. When a lawyer gives you a one-word answer, that's definitive. There's no like weaseling in there. And to me, it is a huge victory. And in a second, I want to talk about what the anti-gunners are doing to kind of counteract what the Supreme Court did, and this battle is going to continue. But this is a huge victory. I mean, because it's true, they were restricting the right to bear arms. Yeah, you can keep it at home, but you can't take it out with you. And to me, I mean, I'm in Florida now. I just moved here, but I moved here from Texas. And I just became a first-time gun owner last September. So Texas already had permitless carry, so I was able to carry, but I got my license anyway. And there's reciprocity with Florida, but it's, to me, it's like the idea that after I started carrying, like, it's weird for me to not carry. Like, if I happen to forget my pistol when I go out, I don't feel right. And I couldn't imagine, you know, because everybody knows you're probably not going to need to use it. Most people don't. But if you are in a city where there's a lot of crime or there's issues, the idea that you wouldn't be allowed to defend yourself or have the means by which you can do that, it's scary, because you know these people want to spread this to the rest of the country.
Yeah, and you know, I think the other critical thing that happened here, to add on to your point, is that it was how the Supreme Court went about making this decision and said about how other courts across the country should apply the Second Amendment. And this is very important. The Supreme Court said that to apply the Second Amendment, to figure out if other gun regulations are constitutional or not, you have to apply a test called the text and history test. And they said that what's been going on for the last 10 years or so, a little game, and they were more polite than this. But what they really said, Jeff, was that the lower courts in the blue states have been playing a game. They basically did a two-part test. And they said this. They said, well, you know, there's a gun control regulation in New York. Does it infringe on the Second Amendment? Yes, it does. But now we have to go to step two. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what's more important, the Second Amendment with respect to Mark or Jeff's rights, or the public interest in whatever the government said? And surprise, surprise, in almost every single one of those cases, the government judges said that the government's public policy infringing on the Second Amendment was justified and allowed. So the Supreme Court in the Bruin case said, no more, never again. And they could not have made this clearer. They said this repeatedly. No more social balancing test. No more tiers of scrutiny, which is a metaphor, a euphemism for balancing test. No more balancing. Yeah. If a law violates the Second Amendment's text or its foundational history, it is unconstitutional and may not be enforced. And then they went on, Jeff, and said this, and this is very telling as to what your story you just gave, which is this. They made clear. They said the Second Amendment applies to cities and to urban dwellers as well. It's not just for the rural. It's not just for the countryside. It's not just for West Texas. It is for the cities as well. And I should note, there is clear historical precedent to support this. This is a story I like to tell on my channel that, again, should be taught in American classrooms, but usually is not. And that is the story of the Boston Massacre. You see, what happened is, in the Boston Massacre, you had a group of American Bostonians that confronted in protest a group of British soldiers that were protecting the custom house. And there's a debate about what happened, but what we do know happened is that the British eventually opened fire and killed several members of the Bostonians, several Americans. But here's the critical part when it comes to the Second Amendment. There was a trial of the British soldiers, and the lawyer representing the British soldiers was none other than John Adams, one of our earliest presidents and one of our key founding fathers. And what John Adams said in defense of those British soldiers in trial in Boston at the start, really right before the American Revolution, he said, we know that Americans here and the Bostonians here have a right to bear arms. They have a right to self-defense, but they must do so peaceably. And the people that had arms on that day in Boston among the colonists had that right to bear arms. We don't deny that. So even back then in the city of Boston, which at the time was really arguably the largest, most urban city in all of America at the time of our founding, that in Philadelphia, you have John Adams, the prominent lawyer representing the British soldiers, saying, of course you have a right to bear arms in cities outside the home to defend yourself, but you must do so peaceably. And again, that historical lesson was not lost on the Supreme Court when they issued the NYSERPA versus Bruin case that says New Yorkers, including those New Yorkers living in New York City, have a right to keep and bear arms outside to protect themselves from the predators among us.
Yes, awesome, and very happy about it. But like I was saying, they're pushing back. So after these 3 mass shootings that we went through, you've got people like Vice President Kamala Harris saying, "Oh, we got to ban assault weapons. We got to bring back the ban that expired in 2004." Now, first off, have they figured out what an assault weapon is yet, or did they do that before? Because I'm still confused. And whenever I ask one of them, "What's an assault weapon?" I mean, I get crickets.
Well, the interesting way in which the assault weapon concept came about was by a very famous and prominent and very smart individual by the name of Josh Sugarman, who ran an organization that was really about gun control, a few decades ago. Now, what Josh Sugarman said, and this is, a well-known quote, he said that, using the phrase assault weapon will allow us, and I'm paraphrasing here, Jeff, but he basically said that, look, using the phrase assault weapon, that these, black guns, if you will, they look scary. And he says, if we label these things assault weapons, most Americans don't know the difference between an automatic rifle or a semi-automatic rifle. They just don't know the terminology. A lot of these urban journalists have never touched guns. They have no idea. So he said we should label these things assault weapons because people don't know the difference. And that's basically, if you look at the number of times the words assault weapon were used before Josh Sugarman made that comment in the press versus the days afterwards, you can see that really his plan actually did work. So now you have journalists and people using the reference to assault weapon when all they're really talking about are ordinary semi-automatic firearms that are not even as powerful as most deer hunting rifles, but they look scary to the average person that's unfamiliar with firearms technology. So they conflate machine guns, which have effectively been banned. Well, they've been banned by and large since 1986, and we've been kind of banned really since 1934. You can debate how you define ban, but basically machine guns have been registered and dramatically limited in American society since the 1930s. Those are fully automatic. You hold the trigger down and it keeps firing until you run out of ammo or you let go of the trigger. Those are automatic weapons. Those are not what we're talking about here. In fact, I don't even know the last decade in which someone was killed in America with an automatic weapon, by the way. People get killed with so-called semi-automatic weapons, but of course, this distinction is lost and either on purpose or not on purpose. But of course, what we're talking about here when Kamala Harris and Joe Biden talk about weapons of war or assault weapons are just ordinary American rifles that we all own. The most popular rifle in the United States, I'm sure you've talked about this before, Jeff, is the AR-15 style rifle. And this is not my opinion or your opinion. The ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, issued a statement as part of their proposed ghost gun regulations about 2 or 3 months ago. And they specifically said in this statement that AR-15s are the most popular rifle in America. Now, this is really important, Jeff, because, they use this propaganda term, but this is why on my channel, The Four Boxes Diner, I try to get into the details. So let's step back for a second. The U.S. Supreme Court, in no fewer than four cases in the last 12 years or so, have made it clear that semi-automatic rifles, which are commonly owned, are protected arms. Let me be clear. The Supreme Court has set forth a standard of what is a protected arm. It says that an arm, a weapon that is commonly owned or possessed by Americans for lawful purposes is a protected arm under the Second Amendment. Now, let me give you a very specific case, not my case, not your case, the U.S. Supreme Court's case. In the year 2016, the Supreme Court decided a case called Caetano versus Massachusetts, which the anti-gunners never seem to talk about. It seems to get lost in all this political rhetoric. Well, in the 2016 case of Caetano versus Massachusetts, the U.S. Supreme Court said in a decision that stun guns are protected arms under the Second Amendment because they are commonly possessed by Americans for lawful purposes. Now, let me ask you this. How many stun guns do you think existed in the United States in civilian hands in 2016? Well, we know the answer because Justice Sam Alito in his concurrence noted, I believe there's about 200,000 stun guns in America, in 2016 when the Supreme Court issued this. Now, how, in contrast, let's compare that with the number of AR-15s in America, which literally runs into the tens of millions of AR-15s in American hands. And how many deaths do they account for in any given year, depending on, which statistic you're looking at? Well, anywhere between 2 and maybe 500 deaths a year from all forms of rifles, including but not limited to the AR-15. So we're talking about a weapon that basically is used in very few crimes. Sometimes they're used in high-profile crimes, yes, but very few crimes, handguns. And they basically have been declared constitutionally protected by the Supreme Court, although they haven't taken an AR-15 ban case yet. I suspect that's next up on the list. And again, so I think, first of all, these words, Jeff, are weapons of war, assault weapons. They're propaganda terms. They mean nothing. You walk into a gun store and ask for an assault weapon or weapon of war, they won't even know what you're talking about. Beyond that,
I was going to ask you about the weapons of war thing. Definitely.
And of course, they account for relatively few homicides in any given year.
So, okay. So, yeah, let's talk about the weapons of war thing. Because when I hear that talking point, I mean, it's usually from people who don't know what they're talking about. I mean, technically, I mean, any gun could be used in the war, I would imagine.
Sure.
But to me, is there more to this than just them putting that label to make it sound scarier, like assault rifle, or if there's something I'm missing here? Because that's all it seems like to me.
Well, it's actually funny. This is where understanding American history is so important, which is why I really try to talk about the history of the Second Amendment and gun owning in America on the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel. So in the Supreme Court's decision of Bruin, Jeff, in no fewer than 3 instances does the Supreme Court itself a couple weeks ago specifically point out instances where American civilians are using military firearms in civilian life. For example, in Clarence Thomas's opinion in Bruin, Clarence Thomas writes that after the Civil War, African Americans freed the freed slaves, the African Americans were using army muskets from the Civil War to protect themselves against people that were trying to hurt them. So that was a weapon of war, weapons of war that were actually used in an actual war, the Civil War, that killed 600,000 American lives, right? 600,000 people died in the Civil War using the same exact weapons that the freed slaves were using after the Civil War. And Clarence Thomas in the Bruin decision is explaining that carrying these weapons outside the home after the Civil War demonstrated our long tradition in American life of allowing Americans to carry firearms in public. And they also gave a couple other examples of former Army and Navy pistols that are used by Americans. And we know this is not unusual, Jeff, because even after World War I, after World War II, you in the United States could literally buy weapons that were used in World War II all across the country. Italian rifles, American handguns, all these weapons that were used in World War II came back to the United States and they were sold to civilians. And yet we didn't have these crazy mass shootings going on between 1945 and the 1990s. I think something else is going on. It's not the weapons of war flooding our streets. We've had weapons of war in the United States every single day of our lives for 200 plus years, and we haven't had these problems. So the problem is not the guns. And of course, the reality is, Jeff, these AR-15s, these semi-automatic rifles are not weapons of war. You would never go to war with these guns. These are really neutered versions. They look scary and they look cool, but the reality is, they're not the sort of thing you would take into war with you at all. They're not weapons of war at all. Again, this is a phrase that's a propaganda term. And even if they were weapons of war, arguably based on the Supreme Court's precedent and everything else in our history, they probably would still be protected by the Second Amendment. So the reality is, weapons of war, we've had them before. We've had them for 200 years. We only had a problem recently, but it has nothing to do with guns. I think, we have mental health and a failure to defend our country with police and everything else. Those are really the problems we're facing, not people with guns carrying them peaceably.
Yeah, and the other part of it too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but part of the intent behind the Second Amendment was that it was supposed to be a check on government if they were to become tyrannical. So the idea is that the citizenry would need to have weapons that are on par with what the government has to prevent them from becoming tyrannical in the first place. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Supreme Court has said repeatedly, it's not just the Supreme Court, our history books teach this. If you go back to the founding era, what was the first thing? And this is, again, an example, Jeff, of what I try to talk about on the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel, where I try to talk about this kind of history that I think gets lost. So people, when they talk about the start of the American Revolution and what caused the Americans to decide to, declare war against Great Britain or England, they always talk about no taxation without representation. They talk about these economic issues, which were true. They were economic concerns, for sure. But what gets lost in this is the role of gun control against the Americans that anger the Americans to the point where they declared independence. Give you an example. So before the American, let's just take the most famous. There are many examples of this, by the way, but I'll give you the most famous one. Why were the British leaving Boston in One If I Land, Two If I Sea, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride? Remember all that history? Well, let me ask this.
Yeah,
Why were
yeah.
the British leaving Boston? What were they doing? Well, the answer was they were going to Lexington and Concord. And why were they going to the countryside of Massachusetts? Were they going there to rape, to pillage, to burn down the crops, to torture the people? No. Guess what? The British were leaving Boston to capture the guns and the black powder and the ammunition that the colonists had been storing. They thought they had been storing, and the British left Boston to try to confiscate and engage in gun control of the
Mm,
colonists. And when they got to that green in Lexington and Concord on the greens, guess what happened? The Americans said, "You're not taking our guns," and we had the famous shot heard around the world, which started the American Revolution.
right.
The American Revolution literally started over an attempt by the
Gun
English
control.
to engage in gun control against Americans, and the Americans said, "We're not giving up our guns." So this again is the kind of history that gets lost. So yes, the idea of an armed citizenry thwarting tyranny goes literally back to before the American Revolution, and that is a major reason why they did put the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms into the Bill of Rights itself. And after the Constitution was up and running, the first commentator to write a prominent historical intellectual treatise on what the Constitution meant was an early Supreme Court justice by the name of Joseph Story, who's a very important intellectual in American society. A lot of people don't know him. And he wrote the definitive book in the early 18th century, like 20, 30 years after the Constitution was first written. And what did he say about the purpose of the Second Amendment? He literally says that one of the key parts of the Second Amendment was to thwart tyranny, thwart domestic insurrection, and to thwart foreign invasions. He was one of the earliest Supreme Court justices on the court. I think he was appointed by Thomas Jefferson, if I recall correctly. And he wrote the definitive treatise in the early 19th century of what the Second Amendment and the Constitution meant. And that's what he said about it. So this is not something that we make up here in the 21st century. All of these items that we talk about are literally founded in the 18th and 19th century, the essence of American history. But as you know, Jeff, in my view, a lot of this stuff is just not taught anymore in schools. And I hope to try to educate Americans on their great history that gets lost by what I consider to be mostly anti-gun public school teachers.
Yeah, and I had no idea that it was the gun issue that set it off. I mean, like you said, I know that there was the economic issues, but I didn't know that, the gun control was what set it off. So that I learned something there. And it's funny when you think about the history as it relates to today. I mean, in this ruling, yeah, it is meant to stop a tyrannical government as well as protect your right to self-defense and all that good stuff. But here's what always gets me. Like here's an argument that they always use.
Sure.
They want us to be more like, I mean, you brought up the UK, France, and European nations because they don't have mass shootings and they're not allowed to have guns. And so we should not have guns because that's what's going to happen if they ban guns. Like now, why, in your opinion, why is that argument flawed?
Well, first of all, let's go back to the 18th century to the most basic lesson. People say this is the NRA slogan, but it's not an NRA slogan, and that is this: that if you ban guns, only outlaws will have guns. Okay, people say that's an NRA slogan. It's not true. You know where that slogan comes from? It comes from an Italian Enlightenment philosopher by the name of Cesar Battari. Cesar Battari in the 18th century wrote a book on crimes and punishment, and he specifically said, having looked at all the laws and all the societies around the world, and says that arms control, gun bans only help the criminal and they hurt the innocent and the law-abiding. And he says in the 18th century that nobody who wants to engage in murder and rape and these terrible crimes is going to care one hoot about complying with a gun ban or an arms control law or anything like that. This is Cesar Battari, the 18th century. And the reason why I bring this up, Jeff, and then I'll tie it back into modern life, is that the founding fathers all read, without exception, the book of Cesar Battari and his thinking about criminology and gun control and the like. And it was largely in part of Cesar Battari's knowledge in this space that they realized the importance of putting the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms into the Constitution and preserving a pre-existing right. It's very important to understand the Second Amendment does not create a right to keep and bear arms. It does not create a right at all. The Second Amendment merely recognizes a pre-existing right that had existed long before the creation of our country. And that's why the Second Amendment's written: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That text alone suggests and implies that there was something there before it was ever written, and it was. And again, Cesar Battari points out. So going back to your question about mass shootings, look, the best argument in a public persuasion point of view that the anti-gunners has is they can point to these mass shootings. Well, first, there's several reasons why this is, not really a persuasive argument if you really drill down and you get past emotions. The first is we're not the only country with mass shootings. Over the last month or so ago, there was a major mass shooting in Scandinavia, which had no guns, all gun control laws, and yet mass shooting. Right before Uvalde, there was a major mass shooting down in Mexico. Guess how many gun stores are in all of Mexico? That would be one gun store in the middle of a military base. And then you see this, I believe it was there was also a mass shooting in Africa, in another country that had all sorts of gun control laws. So gun control laws don't stop mass shootings. And obviously look at what happened to the former prime minister of Japan. That was not a mass shooting, but that was a guy with an improvised firearm that assassinated the former prime minister of Japan tragically last week. So this is all illustrations that gun control laws don't stop mass shootings. And of course, we know the Baklavan, mass killing of hundreds of people in Paris. France certainly has massive gun control laws, on and on and on. But let's just focus here on the United States. So the first thing, of course, was we know mass shootings occur all over the world in places where you have gun control. So, if you want to stop mass shootings and mass murders, gun control is not the solution. The right solution, of course, is to have people on the ground ahead of time. So let's just think for a second about this mass shooting concept. What happens when there is any kind of a shooting? Whenever there's a shooting, Jeff, someone picks up the phone and calls 911. Why are they calling 911?
Right.
Well, they're calling 911 to ask that people show up with firearms. And those firearms, by the way, are actual select fire, semi-automatic, and automatic firearms with 30-round magazines, I should add. So they basically call up and say, hey, we have a shooter here that's killing people. Please bring men with guns of the sort of things that we want to ban in civilian life to stop the mass shooting. So the way you stop the mass shooting always is with someone with a gun showing up to either kill the person or to cause the person to kill himself or to capture the person. So, and again, if you look at the number of people that are killed in mass shootings, they're all terrible, but most of these things, of course, take place in gun-free zones. This has been, studied extensively by many people, not least of which is, John Lott, but other people have done this too. If you look at all these instances, you have gun-free zones, which basically is an encouragement for killing. So, you don't allow guns in the schools, and then the guy comes in with a gun and kills everyone. And it's because you didn't defend the kids ahead of time. And what I don't understand, by the way, is why is it that we surround our political elites like Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? Why do they get the benefit of people with firearms? Their lives are protected with guns. What's the point of the guns? If the guns don't save lives, why are we using it to protect our political elites? And in many instances, our financial elites. And why aren't we protecting our kids with people with guns?
That's the question I always ask.
Carry guns as well. And I should add that to me, the lesson of mass shootings in America is really not what the anti-gunners want you to learn. What the anti-gunners want to say is, look, there's a mass shooting and therefore you should give up your guns. No, I think the lesson is the absolute reverse. The lesson is that if the government could really protect us from the crazies, from the terrorists, from the criminals, then they would be doing it. But as we see, and it's not just Uvalde where the police officers apparently stood outside for like an hour before they confronted an 18-year-old kid. Okay. No, it's not just Uvalde. If you go down to Parkland, same thing. The police stood down. If you go down to the Pulse nightclub, although there was initial police interception, they were told to back out of the Pulse nightclub, and they were going to surround it, and SWAT showed up and stood outside for hours as well. So if you look at these mass shootings, the one thing I always take away from it is that the government failed to protect us. The government then shows up and they still don't protect us while people are getting killed, which is why you are your own first responder. And Jeff, this is what I always say. You are your own first responder. The police are not going to be able to protect you. And the old saying goes, when seconds count, police are minutes away. Yep. Keep in mind that in Las Vegas, even in the Las Vegas shooting, the police actually went to the floor below where the shooter was to initially confront him. So even if the police are trying to save your life, okay, odds are they're not be able to, which is why we have to be our own first responders, and we have to be allowed to have our own firearms to protect our lives, because no one cares more about protecting your life and my life than you and I and our families. No stranger getting paid $20 an hour as a police officer is necessarily going to be heroic and or effective in protecting ourselves. So we should have the right to do it. And the founding fathers understood this and ensured that it was enshrined in the Second Amendment.
So, I mean, in light of all that, I mean, because the other thing too is that, you know, there are already more guns than people in America. I think it was like, what, 400,000? So even if you wanted to ban all guns, you couldn't. And in America, with a country as big as ours, with as many people as we have, and as much guns that are already in circulation, because you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, right? Only criminals are going to have these guns, and we've already seen the bad consequences of that. And now that gun ownership is going up, I mean, you're seeing, like in Philadelphia, there was a report talking about how Philadelphia has seen more defensive gun uses now that more people are buying guns. So, I mean, the proof is in the pudding, and the numbers bear that out. Defensive gun uses happen far more often than guns are used in crimes. So, what the I can't remember his name, but the Italian writer, he was right. If you ban guns, you ensure that only the criminals are armed, which puts you in a position where you're vulnerable, because like you just said, the government's not going to save you. Most of the time, they're not going to be able to, even when they try to. So polling, like when I look at polling, there was a recent poll that came out. Most Americans still favor stricter gun laws. Now that margin is shrinking. I've been looking over the past few years when I looked at Gallup. So more people are coming around, but there's still, most Americans want more stricter gun laws. So from what you've seen, and I'm talking about the everyday person, not the elites who just want us disarmed. Why do you think that they're supporting stricter gun laws? Like what's motivating that among regular people?
Well, I think those polls are probably not really right. I think a lot of those polls are probably the same sort of pollsters that said Donald Trump could never win the White House, for example. I think it's a lot better to look at how people behave. And again, if you look at where we are in American life right now, when I was growing up, there was one state that had permitless carry, I mean, you could carry a gun with no permit. That was the state of Vermont. The rest of the states either had no issue or something like that, or you couldn't carry, you had to get a license. Today, we now live in a country where half of America, and that number is going to grow after the Bruin decision, half of America, 25 states allow you to carry a gun permitless with no permit at all, assuming you're a law-abiding citizen. And again, that number is going to grow. We know that the number of people that are buying guns, the number of new gun buyers, all these things are going up. If you really want to know what people are truly thinking, look at how they behave. And the way they're behaving, of course, is to engage in self-reliance, self-protection, buying firearms. Because we all lived through the pandemic of 2020. We looked around on our TV screens and we saw how the police did not protect Portland because of the political leaders. We saw the riots. We saw the mostly peaceful protests of burning down. We saw what happened with Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where but for the fact that if he didn't have that rifle, he probably would be dead today or crippled or paralyzed or something terrible would have happened because a mob was, descending upon him. And he was able to fight it off. And of course, he prevailed in a case that probably arguably never should have even been brought. But set aside the Rittenhouse case, people, whatever they tell strangers on a phone, here's my rule, Jeff. No one is going to say on a phone to a stranger any of the following statements. I have gold in my house, I have guns in my house, and I vote for Donald Trump. Those are the three things that no one will ever say to a stranger on the phone during a poll. That I can assure you. So I think when they poll gun owners, I think you have a sort of a bias there in favor of the people that support gun control. But you are right, Jeff. You said something very compelling, which is people don't report the defensive gun uses. There's a great study by a Georgetown professor named Bill English that shows that approximately 1.67 million people use firearms for self-defense in every given year. That's consistent with other work done by sociologists like Gary Kleck and others. So you're literally looking at millions of defensive gun uses every year by Americans. But the difference is those don't get reported because of the bias in the media, not just the bias against guns. It's also the bias towards selling papers. The old joke or the old statement, if it bleeds, it leads. So you're going to sell more papers. You're going to give more attention to situations where you have a tragic mass shooting, which is very rare. It does happen. It's extremely rare. You're not going to give any real ink or publication to people using guns to defend themselves because A, it doesn't sell that many papers. B, it's often viewed as a local story. And C, of course, it doesn't play into the big city newspaper narratives of the Washington Times. Not the Washington Times. I apologize. The Washington Times is actually very good. But I mean, the Washington Post, the New York Times.
Yeah, and you know it's funny. So Slate put out an article earlier this week that I had to write an article debunking it, and the author claimed that guns are rarely used in self-defense. And it's funny how they kind of massage the definition. He said basically it's very rare that somebody's going to have to shoot somebody in self-defense. That's not necessarily all that a defensive gun use is. What they left out is the fact that a defensive gun use is anytime you use a gun to stop a violent crime. So if somebody's coming up to me with a knife and I pull my gun and they run away, that's a defensive gun use. But they don't tell you that. So they want you to think that, oh, unless you fire the gun, that means it's a defensive gun use. And that is rare. Most people don't have to fire their guns to defend themselves. But even so, guns are used all the time in self-defense to defend themselves or to defend somebody else. And it just speaks to how they basically have to lie about these things in order to sway public opinion. And from what I've seen, honestly, Mark, and this isn't scientific, this is just my opinion, I'd say 70 to 80% of regular people who are against guns or support a lot of gun control know nothing about guns. They don't know anything about the debate. They don't know anything about how they're used or anything like that. Like, just to give you an example, my mom, when I became a gun owner, she was terrified. We're from Southern California originally, so you have to excuse me for that. But terrified of guns because, you know, it's very much discouraged among Californians. And I got one. And, you know, we had conversations and stuff like that. And now she's wanting me, next time I fly back to Texas, to take her shooting so that she can get herself a gun. People are changing their minds, but really a lot of it is just ignorance. I mean, I mentioned, like I told her, you know, at some point I'll get an AR-15 or whatever. And then I joked and said I'll get an AK-47. And she freaked out. She was like, why do you need that? You don't need those types of guns. She thought that I was going to get a fully automatic rifle because of what you talked about before, assault weapons, weapons of war. They have people thinking that these AR-15s are fully automatic. And I had to explain to her, no, these are semi-automatics. It's very difficult to get a fully automatic, and I'm not trying to get that. You pull the trigger once, one bullet comes out, that's it. So I think as people are starting to get more educated on these things, I think that's why so many people are changing their minds. And you're right, the behavior is the better indicator, because I read a report last month in June, gun sales were over 1 million for the 35th consecutive month. So for 35 months in a row, gun sales have been over 1 million. I think that that's a far more compelling figure than what we're seeing with these polls.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you want to know how people, what they're really thinking, look at how they behave. And I always ask, and I've written, you know, books on this, look at the smartest people in the planet. And I put smartest people in quotes, right? But if you look at what there's an old saying in the stock market, which is invest with the smart money, meaning you look at what the smart investors are doing, the Warren Buffetts are doing, and you try to follow and do what they do and try to benefit from their knowledge. So I like to apply this in the context of guns, which is if you look at the smartest people on the planet, you look at our political elites, but then you go beyond political elites. You look at the Hollywood elites. You look at the religious elites like the popes in the Vatican. Right, you look at Prince Harry, and you look at Prince William and the Queen Elizabeth. You look at all these famous people, whether it be the royal elites, the political elites, the Hollywood elites, the financial elites like the Warren Buffetts of the world. Guess what? If you take a look at all these people, what you generally find is they're all surrounded by people with firearms. They got their own private bodyguards that protects them 24/7 in most instances. And why is that? Because they know, although they may, you know, give their anti-gun speeches, they want the benefit of a firearm there to protect them. Now, they may not carry it themselves. They may hire someone to carry it for them, but it's effectively the same. They want to be surrounded by people with guns. And you raise a great point, Jeff, about what does it mean to use a firearm? Well, when most people think about using a firearm, you think about shooting a firearm. But using a firearm is not that narrowly defined. If you go into Times Square, for example, or any city, I mean, Times Square is prominent because, this is the funniest thing. You go into Times Square, in many instances, the NYPD officers are literally carrying select fire AR-15 style rifles on the streets of Times Square with 30 round magazines. And I've always wondered what would happen if you fire one of those in the middle of New York City, how far it would go. But set that issue aside. What is the point of those police officers standing there prominently displaying their select fire machine guns, AR-15 style, their machine guns with their 30 round mags? What's the point of it? They're effectively using guns right there, because by just standing there displaying their firearms and their military prowess, they're effectively deterring criminals from doing bad things right there. So even though they're not firing those guns as they stand in the middle of Times Square looking, scary, they are effectively using those guns to deter crime in Times Square.
Yeah, and that even goes back to the conversation about schools and mass shootings. I mean, you don't hear a lot about mass shootings in a courthouse or in a city council building, because any would-be mass shooter knows that once they fire that first shot, they're dead. That's it. That's a wrap. They're not going to be able to have a body count. So, you translate that into schools. If you have metal detectors and armed guards, it's not so much that that's going to stop them from getting into the school and shooting. It's not that they're going to have to shoot people or that the guards would have to shoot people. It's that it's going to deter people from wanting to even try it. Because if they know they can't get into that school without getting shot, they're not going to do it. Their goal is to kill people. And if they know they're not going to be able to kill people before they're killed, it's less likely that they're going to try it. So to me, it's like those are the aspects of this debate that the anti-gunners don't want to talk about, because, Mark, I mean, you probably experienced the same thing. They don't have an answer for it. And I've seen some of them try, and I'll give them credit. They try to get around the fact that defensive gun uses happen, but defensive gun use is other than the constitutional aspect of it, other than the rights that we have, the defensive gun use is to me the most compelling argument, because if they're used more often to defend yourself or to defend others than they are to be used in violent crimes, then there's no excuse to prevent an average citizen from owning one.
Yeah, and again, it is sort of a emotional problem in the sense, Jeff, that it's a lot easier to get people emotionally ginned up if you can point to dead bodies in a terrible story and say, look, somebody with a gun did terrible things. It's a lot more difficult to point to a successful defensive gun use when there's no victim. Now, of course, there are famous examples of this. I think in my view, the most famous example of the two views of society took place about 15 years ago or so in Hanover, New Hampshire, outside Dartmouth College, one of our prominent Ivy League schools. There's two, and this is a very famous story. There were two, young men, like I think they're both 18 and 19. They decided they were going to kill people. They just decided one day we're going to kill someone. So they knock on a guy's door and they decide they're going to kill him. They actually dug up a hole to bury the guy. They knocked on his door, except this time he showed up, ready for this? He showed up at his door with a Glock. He showed up at his door with a handgun. Wow. And they said, no, never mind. We were looking for directions. And guess what? That man is alive today. In contrast, what happened about 3 days after that? So they're thwarted by this guy, doesn't fire a shot. They knock on the door. He shows up with a Glock. And they're like, yeah, okay, we're going to go somewhere else. 3 days later, these same two criminals do the exact same thing on a different house's door. And unfortunately, they knock on the door of two German professors that teach German were teaching German at Dartmouth College. They were from Germany. They were Europeans. And they let these scumbags in. And these scumbags killed both professors dead. And they were caught. And yes, that's a perfect example. So the guy who was able to save his life with a Glock without firing a shot doesn't get discussed. We only talk about the two dead Dartmouth professors who were killed by the same two scumbags that were deterred from killing the guy down the street because he had a gun, and the German professors, of course, were naive and had no arms. And now they're dead.
Well, yeah, and I think and a lot of it too is that usually if you use a gun to defend yourself in the way the first person did, that doesn't get reported because chances are you don't even call the police on that.
Right.
You don't call the media, so the media doesn't even know about it. So most defensive gun uses aren't ever reported. I mean, you have to do studies to find out how often these things happen, because if, like in my scenario, if somebody comes up to me with a knife and I scare them away, I mean, what's the point of calling the police? They're not going to be able to get the guy. He already ran away. And so that happens. And so you're right, because they do play on the emotions. They play on the times when criminals are successful at killing people. But nobody's asking the questions, how many lives have been saved because we have the Second Amendment and people can carry firearms? I estimate that it would be far more than the ones who get killed because criminals succeed at doing what they do.
Yeah, I mean, and, again, if you look at the statistics, they always want to talk about Europe, and Europe is not necessarily as safe as people think it is, in part probably because of the way they do some of their crime statistics and data compilation. But set that issue aside, if you look at the Western Hemisphere, a lot of the other countries that have strict gun control laws here in the Western Hemisphere have much higher murder rates and everything else. So again, it's not about gun control laws. It's about the reality of criminals. And for some reason, especially in the last few years, I think Americans are realizing that our government is not only unable to protect us, in many instances, they're unwilling to protect us. I mean, we had Kamala Harris before, right? She was literally raising money to bail out the rioters in some of these 2020 protests. She's the vice president of the United States. That's what she thinks about the importance of public safety, as best I can tell. So she wants to disarm law-abiding Americans who had nothing to do with Uvalde, have nothing to do with crime, have never done anything wrong in their lives, many of whom don't even have traffic tickets and have firearms, and yet somehow they're the ones that must be punished for the bad acts of a few. And many of those bad acts, I wonder how many of those, psychopaths. Remember, we used to have, when you were a psychopath or you had a serious mental illness and were endangering yourself or someone else, decades ago, we would try to get you help. We would try to get you an institution. We would try to get you medical treatment. We would try to take care of you. Now it seems to me, and when I talk to my police officer friends who, work the beat, the vast majority of the homeless people they encounter on streets in like New York City, these are really mentally ill people that are homeless now, and they're out on the streets. And the problem is, of course, when you're mentally ill and you're psychopathic and you're schizophrenic, any of these things, you can't tell right from wrong, and you're able to kill someone and not even realize you're doing it because you're mentally ill. And yet they seem to be out on our streets more and more and more. And I'm not surprised that you have these terrible situations taking place in the cities where, crazy people are shoving people onto subways to their death. And unfortunately, it seems to me the focus should not be on law-abiding gun owners and are taking away our Second Amendment rights. The focus should be on laser focused on criminals, violent criminals specifically, as well as people that are demonstrated that they're psychopathic, and not try to mainstream and normalize these people. We got to identify them for what they are and address the threat right there. Do it civilly, professionally, politely, of course. You don't have to be mean about the whole thing, but you got to focus on where the bad actors are coming from and not on the instruments that they use, because there are lots of ways. You saw the story last week, Jeff, where I think a person was killed with a traffic cone in an attack. So it's not the means, it's the people.
I heard about that. Definitely. Okay, so last question. I mean, going back to the Supreme Court decision on Bruin. So that ruling has been handed down, and we're seeing that New York is passing a bunch of laws to restrict where people can bear arms, and they're tightening up their procedure for granting a license. I mean, they're talking about 3 years of social media history they want to look at. They want to talk to people's relatives, all blah 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 blah. I'm sure you're already familiar. California is going to do something very similar, and so are other states. And obviously, those are going to be challenged. How do you see this playing out in the courts over the next few years?
Well, the way I see the behavior of New York and California is, to me, it's analogous to what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, where the United States Supreme Court, in the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, said that separate but equal, as set forth by the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court in the 50s and 60s basically said that the South had to integrate. They could no longer have separate but equal government facilities and public accommodations. That was no longer going to be allowed under the law. And those Southern states, fought and resisted as best they could the encroachment, what they thought was encroachment by the Supreme Court in applying the Constitution. And I think what New York and California are doing is analogous to what we saw in that sort of civil resistance by the Southern states in the Jim Crow era. So I think what's happening here with New York and California is they're doing a few different things, and I think ultimately it's not going to work. The first thing they're trying to do is define everything under the sun as a quote unquote sensitive place or gun-free zone, because the Supreme Court indicated there are narrow exceptions to allow for gun-free zones. And the court specific example were all government, though. They said that public polling, polling places, which is government, could be a sensitive place. They said that public places where you have legislative chambers like Congress, that can be a sensitive place. Again, government. They said courthouses, government can be a sensitive place. They said schools, presumably public schools, can be don't have to be, can be sensitive places. But what New York is doing is they've labeled everything under the sun as sensitive place. They basically said if you serve alcohol, if you're a restaurant, if you're Central Park, if you're a park, if you're a religion, on and on and on. And none of these, I think, at the end of the day, will survive the constitutional muster or scrutiny, because remember, the Supreme Court specifically said that the Second Amendment applies to the cities as well as rural areas. And they specifically said that it would be unconstitutional, and they literally said this in the opinion, Jeff, that it would be unconstitutional if New York decided to declare all of Manhattan Island, which is the main borough in New York City, all of Manhattan to be a sensitive place. And yet that's effectively what the New York
anticipated what they were going to do.
Their nose at the Supreme Court. Ultimately, I don't think that's going to work. The other thing is the Supreme Court made very clear about their licensing requirements. They said, look, what you can have licensing requirements, but it has to be objective. I repeat, objective and narrow and fast. And they said it cannot be subjective. Now, what is the purpose of having an interview with a law enforcement agent? That's all subjective. What are they going to be looking for in social media accounts? Those would be subjective determinations. What is the purpose of reviewing all this? Subjective, subjective, subjective. The Supreme Court made it very clear, including the concurrence of Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts, that this has to be objective and fast. It can't be expensive and it can't be delayed-some. Because remember, the Supreme Court has already struck down a poll tax of $1.50. I repeat, Jeff, $1.50 was a poll tax that the Supreme Court struck down on the right to vote. Now, the types of requirements and training that New York State is contemplating to exercise your right to keep and bear arms, I can assure you, is going to cost more than $1.50. So I think all of this stuff is subject to legal challenge under the Second Amendment and the Bruin decision. And I think you're going to see a tsunami of cases in California and New York that's going to seek to challenge and knock down these laws. And I suspect that quite a few of these legal challenges will actually succeed, and New York and California will eventually have to respect the Second Amendment properly. It may take a few more years to get them where they need to be, but it's going to happen because this court has made it clear it's going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like they're just trying to buy time, or they're desperate. But yeah, I see that happening too. So thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. But before we sign off, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. Again, they can find me at Mark Smith, the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel, about the Second Amendment on YouTube. I mean, I'm also on Twitter and these other social media accounts, but I encourage everyone to go to the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel and learn about the history of the Second Amendment and our Constitution, and sort of the intellectual, scholarly, geeky things that you might not find elsewhere. So you can, defeat you can beat up your anti-gun friends in debates and really be the smartest person in the room when it comes to the text and the history of the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms.
Perfect. Well, thanks for coming on, and hopefully we can have you back soon.
Wonderful. Happy to come back, Jeff.